everyone. Thank you for such a great introduction. It's just, I guess, to give a little more about myself, something about me. So I'm very active as far as the Pan-Africanist fight for liberation. I'm a part of an organization called We Charge Colonialism. I'm also part of the National Conference of Black Lawyers, both of which I'm using in collaboration with a number of people to really draw awareness to the present condition of African people being colonized. And also, if you haven't seen, I also have a YouTube channel, African Esquire TV. You can check that out. I do a lot of different subjects pertaining to African people, whether on the continent or in the diaspora. So that's really what kind of brought me into this work as far as Pan-Africanism. So YouTube, obviously, and media, period, is a really powerful instrument, I think. So I'm gonna share my screen and we'll get started. So I want us to start with, I guess, an interactive tool. I don't know if I can see the chat while I'm doing this, so I guess, Mark, you'll help me out.
I'm ready.
So this is a little bird. We're going to call him Lil Peep. And he's coming to us with a problem. His problem is he's a free bird, but for some reason he can't fly. And he's coming to you, and he wants you to try to figure out what is the solution, or rather, what is the cause of his problem? So I'm gonna give everyone maybe 2 minutes. You know, you can just say whatever you think Little Peep should consider as his problem, and we'll see what you come up with. Okay, have we have any feedback yet?
You have no one to fly to.
Doesn't know where to fly to, okay.
We have another one that says he has not been taught how to fly by his parents and family.
Okay, not been taught how to fly. Anyone else? What is Little Peep's problem? He's coming to you.
Jamaica says, Lil Peep should spread his wings and try to fly.
Spread his wings and try to fly. Okay. So Little Peep, he takes all of your advice. He goes and tries flying, but it still doesn't work. So he comes to you. He says, okay, I have something that I think will help you figure out what is wrong with me. Do we have any more advice for Little Peep?
He needs to go and find his tribe.
Find his tribe. No one else wants to get that, I guess? Okay, how about now?
Oh, yes, I get it.
Anyone taking a stab at this before I go to the next one? I'm gonna reveal the answer.
Charlotte says, why does he think he can't fly? We talk about it.
Okay, so let's go here. Oh, and he's tried flying, and for some reason it doesn't work. So he's in a cage, like Nigel said. Now, great job, Nigel. This, I think, is very reminiscent of us for a lot of reasons. One, if anyone were to look at Little Peep himself and try to come up with an analysis of why you can't fly, you're not going to get any information on that. No matter how many times you analyze them, you could do biological tests on him, you're not going to get an answer. And even whenever I showed you one bar of the cage, you really didn't have an answer. I showed you a few bars, you know, it kind of is starting to resonate something, but not really a clear answer. But when we see the system or this cage in its totality, we can see why it is that he is not able to fly. And we should think about this as African people. You know, this presentation, yes, most of my research is basically based in African people in the United States. But one thing that transcends is that if you're in the UK or another dominant white society, we are all subjected to systems. And these systems have us basically at the mercy of a dominant white society. And oftentimes that society tries to impose on us their solutions to our problems, tries to diagnose us. And if they're not taking a total look at how all of the different things function, how every bar of the cage comes together and creates our condition, then their analysis is lacking. Think also, what if you know, we had different ideas about what was wrong with little Peep. You know, what if someone said, oh, it must be he's not healthy, you know, maybe he needs some type of medicine. And, you know, let's say we gave him that medicine, that could have had an adverse effect on him. I think that's very reminiscent of what we see happen to African people. We have white dominant society put out prescriptions on what is wrong with us. And whenever their prescription does not heal us, there's not really any accountability because it oftentimes worsens the traumas that we all experience. So while a lot of this is talking about the United States, I'm very sure that this will transcend to you, whoever you are, wherever you are in the diaspora, because we're all dealing with a global system of white supremacy. The system of white supremacy replicates itself. We should know that our oppressors also study each other. So we know the United States studies Germany, Germany studies UK, you know, it all goes together because all of these powers, they have a protected interest in seeing African people remain inside of the position that we're in. We should also remember what Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey told us. He said, everywhere I go, whether I go to Jamaica, England, United States, African people are all inside of the worst condition. African people are all are doing the worst, are fighting the most, or the most impoverished, the most homeless, whatever. That's a common theme. So clearly the system is working as one when it comes to our demise. And so for that, we have to draw these parallels and understand that the struggle in America is also the struggle in UK, is also the struggle in the Caribbean, and also the struggle in the continent of Africa. So with that, we're going to look at, and then if anyone has questions going throughout, Mark will let me know. So we're going to go to the issue that is presented, the issue that I decided to dissect whenever I wanted to write this book. Now, I'm now a civil rights attorney, but previous to that, I was an attorney working for, I represented children in abuse and neglect cases. And there's a lot of problems inside of the abuse and neglect world, some of which I've also heard exist, and from my small research of what happens in the UK, also happens there. In the United States, African children are overrepresented inside of the child welfare system. Now, the overrepresentation is really stark whenever you look at specific localities. For example, in California, African children are 5.4% of the population, only 5.4, but they represent 19.6% of the foster care population. Then inside of Pennsylvania, 13% of the population, that's African children are in that state, but they're 41.6% of the foster care population. In the state of New Jersey, African children are 13.8% of the population of that state, but 41.5% of the foster care population. Illinois is probably, is definitely the worst state when it comes to disproportionality. And if you know anything about Illinois, Chicago, that city, you know that it has a real history of being, I believe it's America's most segregated city. African children are only 15.7% of the population there, but they make up 51.4% of the foster care population. And it gets worse, particularly when you look at certain cities, because we know that states obviously are, you have white people, you have Black people, you have Asian people, you have all types of people inside of a particular state. But when you ever look inside of New York City, for example, African children are only 15% of the population, but 57% of the foster care population. Chicago, as I said, the worst. African children make up 26.7% of the population in the city of Chicago, but 76.8% of the foster care population. So a lot of people have described for this reason the foster care system as a system of racial apartheid. So whenever I was looking at these issues, you look for answers. You know, we all look for answers. We see the disparate things happening to our people, and we're like, okay, like, what is happening? And you'll get a lot of diagnosis from people. You'll get a lot of people saying, oh, we just need to support families more. We need to do this more, do that more. But in my opinion, these people oftentimes are lacking because a lot of the analysis that comes out about African people is more responding to our symptoms rather than going to the root cause. So whenever I was doing research for this book, I found a theory called systems analysis. And I felt like it very perfectly laid out how we should actually analyze the systems of white supremacy as they affect our people. So it says systems analysis is a methodology that regards systems as goal-seeking and as having one or more purposes. Therefore, it evaluates the outputs of a system to uncover the system's actual goals. So for example, whenever we look at what we were talking about with our friend Little Pete, We are looking at the outcomes, and we're not looking at, we're not looking at what the system says it's for. So for example, the cage might say that, oh, we're here to protect him, or we're there to keep him from predators. But Lil Peep might say, well, I was protected when I was in the wild. I was able to go around and I knew how to stay away from predators. So it's not keeping me any safer. In some ways, it's actually making me more vulnerable because I'm trapped. If a predator or someone wants to come and do harm to me, I can't even fly away like I can usually. So I don't believe it's safety that you're concerned with. And so a systems analysis would say, well, the goal is what is actually happening. What is actually happening is that he's prevented from flying because he is being limited by this cage that you put around him. So you look at like a real life example. Let's say the mass incarceration system as it exists in the United States. Someone might say that's for public safety. They say, oh, it's because we need to jail up all these criminals and, allow people to live in safe communities. But when you actually think about it, we're not safer because of the prison industrial complex and what it's done to African people in the United States. What has happened, though, is you have been able to control African people better, but we're not doing better. So that's what is purpose of systems analysis. It says when using a systems analysis, it's not enough for a system, go back. It's not enough for a system to state its goals. Instead, one must look at a system's function as well as its internal structures of that system, along with any subsystems and their functions. So I don't know if you have like examples of systems that you have encountered where what they say they're for is very different than what they're actually for. If you have examples, I would love to hear more about that. But this is a common occurrence, I think, throughout the global colonial system. You have systems like the IMF and the World Bank, and they're saying that they're for helping the poor countries to rise up and climb, out of poverty and become developed. And what has actually happened? The opposite has happened. These countries are completely drowning in debt. So we're looking at the results and saying that is what the actual intention is. So a law professor, her name is Tanya Sim Cooper. She says, under systems analysis, the true purpose is not the system's own rhetoric about what its purpose or mission is, but rather how it behaves over time. If there is a consistent behavior over time, quite likely a feedback loop exists or some mechanism is creating that consistent behavior. And I'm sure this makes sense to a lot of you because one thing we know about the system of white supremacy, if there's anything that the system does not want to happen, it knows how to correct itself. So if the system is not functioning to the support of the white dominant society, they know how to put mechanisms to either change the system or start a new system. So whenever we see outcomes of African people that are completely backwards, we have to know they see the problems, they see the contradictions, and they're only continuing it because they want those results to continue to be what we experience. So we're going to take this analysis and we're going to go to the child welfare system, try to understand, when African families in the United States were subjected to different systems, what is the origins, what is the actual purpose of that system? So something about the American child welfare system, it really derived from the English child welfare system inside of the traditional sense. At a certain time, English common law, like you really treated children like it's a private matter. You really don't even get involved, especially if the children are from a rich family. So that was adopted by the United States. They did not get involved with children. It was a private matter, but all of that shifted whenever there was an immigrant problem. So the immigrant problem occurred through the 1850s through the 1900s. And what you saw was two major waves of mass immigration from Europe that drastically shifted the composition of America's northern cities. Newly immigrated Europeans were discriminated against and not considered white. That's something I'll emphasize because a lot of people, we don't know that. Whenever the Italians came to America, they were not treated white. They were treated as, they would say, white niggers. Same thing with the Irish, the Germans, the European Jews. Whenever these people came to the United States, they were oftentimes discriminated against. Of course, never as bad as African people or Native Americans, but they were also inside of a class that was not welcomed by the dominant society. And as a result, whenever discrimination happens, what happened was poverty grew. And crime grows whenever poverty grows. So it kind of became really unsustainable for these major cities, the big one being New York City, to have all of these people who are poor. And so this movement came out. is called the Child Savers Movement. And you had these caseworkers, these social workers going throughout the cities, and they were going to save these poor immigrant children. Now, the Child Savers, they were white, Anglo-Saxon, they were Protestant, and they oftentimes came from middle-class backgrounds. Their goal was not to protect children. That's something that has to be emphasized. They called themselves child savers, but they were really concerned with crime prevention. They were actually looking for what behaviors can we see that are going to turn into crime at some point. It was driven really by social anxiety. So child maltreatment that they cared about, it was poverty. You know, they didn't care about abuse. They cared about homelessness, vagrancy, things that they felt like were going to lead to crime at some point. Now, whenever children were taken, they could be put into reformatories, they could be put into different facilities for the poor, or they could put inside of this arrangement called fostering, where they would be sent with families that were not their own families. And a lot of times it was alternative to institutional care, but a lot of times fostering actually was a way for the family, the host family, to make money because they oftentimes put those children to work. Now we're going to talk about the orphan train movement because it's a very specific example of how the system addressed this problem of an influx of immigrants. So this is from 1854 to 1929. It saw the removal of 250,000 poor immigrant children from New York City, and they literally put these kids on trains and sent them out west. And so the guy who came up with this concept, his name was Charles Loring Brace. He said, the family is God's reformatory, and every child of bad habits who can secure a place in a Christian home is in the best possible place for his improvement. So the logic of it was that we're going to take these children from the environment of New York City, we're going to put them out west, we're going to put them with these Anglo-Saxon white families, these Christian families, and from there, they're going to be able to be assimilated. This is what we call environment theory. White supremacists, and this is global, whenever you read, for example, about the different Europeans who would go to Africa and they would theorize, these Africans, they're backwards because they're in the hot Africa. And if they came to Europe in Nordic temperatures, they would turn into a civilized person. They actually said these things. It was the same theory. Their theory was we take these kids away from New York City or where they're with their families. We're going to ship them off. And from that new environment out west, they're going to become assimilated. So these are just some pictures so you can just have an idea of what was happening. As you see, a bunch of children literally like boarding a train. So we're going to take a brief break and we're going to open it up for a systems analysis. So I told you all what a systems analysis is. We're looking at the outcomes. We're not looking at the goals. I should also tell you as an added, though, that a lot of the results of the orphan train movement that children lost connection to their families. Many of them lost their cultures. For example, like let's say you were German and you were put with a white English white family. They would oftentimes give you your host family's race. So from there on, you would be considered English. And a lot of children obviously had horrible effects from that. It's a tragedy that's something that happened in American history. But just doing a systems analysis, I mean, what would the audience say that the goals of the child welfare system were at its inception? I'll give a minute or two.
Feel free to raise your virtual hands or else type in the chat.
Yeah, I have a theory.
And Nigel, is that you?
Yeah, I was just thinking, like, I can definitely see the plan to keep, well, particularly African children, in kind of the working class group, so they were only basically fit for labor, manual labor, and only enjoying the industrial state rather than the intellectual and the intelligentsia or the middle classes in the UK. I think that was a very deliberate plan and very deliberate goal of the system here.
Yeah, I think I've observed that too over in the United States very much.
Charlotte has said in the chat, First of all, in Australia to create a white Australia. But secondly, she also says it's a system based on ideologies of racial superiority and cultural prejudices. So indoctrination to remove the African from the child.
Absolutely.
And I would personally want to, add on to that, like the quote you said, you shared, where it was a child of bad habit. It means that there was some sort of perspective that these groups reared children of bad habit, and this needed to be unlearned or undone somehow.
Yeah, and there was a lot of quotes like that from him, where you can clearly see, like, this is an idea that the parents are inherently broken. And it's not the society that's inflicting all this hardship on the children and the families. It has to be the parents. So, yeah.
I think there's something about civilizing in there as well, like the belief that, that there's the savior complex in rescuing the kids from the savagery of their parents.
Yeah.
The savagery of the Africanness that would remain in many of these immigrants.
Yeah, for sure. So there's no more comments. I'll go to the next slide.
You do have a question. I was hoping to.
Oh, we can do that. Yeah, let's do that.
Sure. Pauline is asking, how did the children of immigrants in the USA affect children of recently freed enslaved Africans?
So we're going to get into the African child, obviously. But what happened at the time is that African children were basically completely barred from the child welfare system. We weren't deemed worthy of saving, even though we know that saving was complicated. So essentially at that time, we took care of our own. The only time that you would see some type of intervention is like if they committed a crime. Now, there became a movement for, having juvenile facilities for white children, but that didn't happen at the same time of Black children. Black children were put into adult jails. So basically, it's like, stay with your family. We don't care that you're poor. And if you commit a crime, that's the only time that we'll step in and we'll put you in a jail.
She has amended the question to sort of focus on policy. So how did the policy for children of immigrants affect children of recently?
Oh, we're going to get into that. So actually, but let's go to the next slide. So I just want you to see, like, this is my systems analysis of what the system's about. And it mirrors a lot of what was already said. But yes, it was created for social control. Non-whites, they were deemed a threat. There was social anxiety. There was also a real fear of riots and things like that. All of this was part of the motivation. And also the goal, as we said, was assimilation. They wanted to find a way to bring these backwards immigrants into white society, into being like Anglo-Saxons. And as you see today, like we don't, in the United States, we really don't think differently about an Italian American versus like an Irish American. We just see white at this point. So you could say that their goal was effective at eliminating their own cultural differences in a lot of ways. This I just wanted to point out though, because this shows you the outcomes. Because today in foster care, 61% of the children in the American foster care system is because of neglect. And neglect is essentially a crime of poverty. The mom couldn't provide enough food. There was not enough supervision. The child, looked dirty. These are neglect things. So it's just a real misconception, I think. A lot of people think children in foster care were abused. But in fact, I think the stat is on here. Says drug abuse, physical abuse. Only 12% of children in the foster care system were actually physically abused. So this is something and sexual abuse is another one. That's 4%. Overwhelmingly, this is a crime of poverty. So let's apply, before we apply this to African families, I want to apply this very briefly to Native American families. Let's see if this systems analysis is appropriate. So obviously, whenever the Europeans decided to come over and take over the Americas, they had a problem. The problem was there was already a people who were there. And so they had to find things to do. Obviously, we know that the Europeans wiped the Native Americans out. They did so a lot of times through warfare, through genocide. But at one point, it became unpopular to just keep killing people. And so they tried to find ways to do the good thing. That's like, let's bring them into our culture. So they tried to assimilate Native Americans. Very briefly, there's two two prior things before the child welfare system was used. There's the Dawes Act. That was an act where they essentially said Native Americans live communally, just like African people did prior to colonialism. They live communally. This idea of private property was not inside of their culture. Well, they said, okay, we're going to take your land and we're going to distribute it and we're going to give you your own piece of land. You will not share it anymore. And this was their way of trying to bring them into white society. And it actually worked. It killed, doing this act killed thousands of indigenous Native American languages because it just really destroyed their culture. And then something that you might have heard of in recent times, because there's been in Canada, there's been some schools that have been uncovered, the Indian boarding school movement. Now, this was a movement that we're going to take Native American children, we're going to put them inside these boarding schools, and the idea was to assimilate them. The one who created the school was a man named Captain Richard Pratt. He had a speech called "Kill the Indian and Save the Man." He says, "It isn't a mistake to think that the Native American is born an inevitable savage. He's born like a blank, like all the rest of us, but left in the surroundings of savagery. He grows to possess a savage language, superstition, and life. When left inside the surroundings of civilization, he'll grow to possess a civilized language, life, and purpose. Transfer the infant white to the savage surroundings, he'll grow to possess a savage language, superstition, and habit." So we see right here, same thing as I told before, environment theory. We're going to transfer the Native Americans to a white environment, and that's going to bring them into our society. I just wanted to show really quick so you can see the assimilation campaign. These are some before and after pictures. You can find a lot more online. They literally said, "Oh, look what we did, everyone. It's a postcard. Yay." Like we took this man and he was a savage before, but now he's civilized. A young boy. They made the boys cut their hair. That's something that they have in their culture, but no longer. Some young girls. So briefly, the Native Americans also became a subject for child welfare intervention. So the United States government, the Hoover Commission put out a recommendation. They said the basis for the historic Indian culture has been swept away. Traditional tribal organization was smashed a generation ago. Assimilation must be the dominant goal of public policy. And the Bureau of Indian Affairs created a program that was going to be called the Indian Adoption Project. This ran from 1958 into 1967. Now, over 13,000 Native Americans were adopted by white couples. Before this law was created for Native Americans to try to protect them from the system called ICWA, before that, 75 to 80% of Native American families living on reservations had at one time had at least one child that was in the foster care system. But ICWA passed inside of 1978. It's important to emphasize, even with this law that specifically protects Native American children, for example, there's supposed to be a law, if you're going to take a child from their parent, you have to put that child with a Native American family, and you have a higher burden of proof whenever you're going to court to try to say that we should remove this child from this Native American family. Even with that, Native Americans are still drastically overrepresented inside of the child welfare system. So the law might have done some things, but it's still finding other ways to operate as far as whatever their goal is. So very brief. Systems analysis, what was the goal of the child welfare systems towards Native American children? I told you the outcomes, children vastly adopted by white families to this day, disproportionately inside of the child welfare system. Does anyone have thoughts on that?
Sorry, can you repeat your question, please?
Sure. I was saying, applying what we know so far about the child welfare system, we're going to do a systems analysis. So we're trying to analyze what was the system created for based on the outcomes that the system has shown us.
Is this towards Africans particularly?
Well, right now we're Native Americans. We have a whole section of Africans.
Oh, Native American. Wow, this is hard for me because my first child is part Native American. So thinking.
Yeah, they've suffered a lot. And for obvious reasons, because this is your land. I mean, we have to take it, and we have to supplant your population with our population. So African people in the United States and Native Americans have had it very bad.
Shelley says a similar civilizing attempt and goal.
Yes. Civilizing, yes.
I think it was extermination, actually. I would go as far as that, as far as I know the Native American history, just to kill them off and steal that land. I mean,
Yes.
they have sovereign land, right? So they basically wanted to annex their land.
Yeah. They took all the land and left them today with some horrible conditioned land that they can't even grow things on the same. Yeah.
Sorry, I was going to say we've got some messages in the chat as well that would resonate and agree with this. Dominique says this is a genocide of a people through cultural erasure. And Jamaica says kill their resistance to white rule and assimilation.
Yeah, I agree. And, you know, another thing to emphasize, like Nigel said, like extermination, that's probably more appropriate if you think about it. A lot of people, the population of Native Americans have disappeared. So a lot of people, even if you were Native American, you don't have the same connection to your tribe, your people, your community. So for example, with the Indian boarding school, a lot of the kids that went there, whenever they tried to go home and reconnect with their family, like they either were snooty and like felt like they were too good for them, or a lot of times their culture had been so altered that they weren't even relating the same to their own people. I think we can draw parallels there for our people. Some things that happen to us whenever we're forcibly assimilated.
That's true. I was going to say, Dominique says that assimilation is a form of genocide, an outright Holocaust. Full stop, end of discussion for me.
Yes,
I think we all agree with that.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's get to the African child.
Oh, before we move on, can you take one question?
Oh, okay, go ahead.
Yes, this is from Pauline. How do we protect vulnerable families in our community from social services intervention, stronger extended family networks, viable economic systems, housing, etc.?
Yes, and I'll definitely get into that more. But I think you kind of like hit the nail on the head. We have things in our indigenous culture that have protected us from white supremacy. I personally believe that for African people who went through slavery in the United States, that if it were not for our African culture, we would have been wiped out, because something about our African culture is the resilience and the way that we take care of each other. You don't even have to be related to this person. You are kin. So that's what protected us. And I think that that's what's going to protect us going forward. But the issue that I think a lot of us people have is that it's a mind shift, because a lot of us want to assimilate into white society. And I'll talk about that briefly. Like there was a movement in the African community in America, like, yeah, we want to assimilate. And it's part of the brainwashing that has happened to our people. We think that white society is where it is. That's where we want to go. But we're not understanding that that leaves us inside of a volatile environment. And so today, you know, I think a lot of the struggle is organizing an effort with African people who agree that we have a culture that needs to be protected. We have a community that needs to be protected. So we have to shift the narrative away from assimilation, as it is today in America, at least, and I'm sure in the UK. We have to shift this narrative from assimilation and shift it towards caring for ourselves, kinship, you know, community, communal caring. These are the things that have helped us before. And I think if we can weaponize them in a modern sense, they will help us again. Are we good to go?
Yeah, one more question you might address as you go on. It's from Yvonne. Has much changed since that time in terms of policy?
So I would say, you could say with European Americans, you know, they, like I said, they were assimilated effectively. They were brought into white. Native Americans, the ones who still hold on to and have their culture, they're such a small percentage of the population that they were like basically wiped out. Many Native people who were originally subject to those systems have been integrated into white culture. So a lot of people might not even know that they have Native American heritage. And this is what assimilation does, correct? Like it's the purpose is that you don't know who you were. Instead, you identify and take on the identity of a new person, a new thing. So the result has been that I would think that they have been satisfied with the result. Native American culture is wiped out, and European cultures, they are all a part of the dominant society. Like if I hear of an officer killing a Black kid, I don't think about the fact that it was Irish versus Anglo-Saxon, like it's just white. So yeah. Okay, so I'm going to go to the next section. So let's talk about child welfare towards Black. So as I said, kinship networks were really our strength. And the thing is, because the child welfare system did not want to care for Black children, up until really the 60s, that's where things started to shift, we were left to ourselves. So, you know, let's say mom's unavailable, mom's having some type of mental issue, you know, dad, you know, he has to go to work somewhere, like whatever reason, your parents weren't available. You had aunties or uncles who would step in, you had grandmas, grandpas, or you had just people in the neighborhood who were part of the community. That's how we literally functioned prior to being brought into the child welfare system. And it was very effective, in my opinion. Now, ironically, the push to have African families adopted by white families came from an organization called the National Urban League. It's very tragic because it's a civil rights organization that exists to today. I'm sure most of the people who are in the Urban League today are not aware of this history. But yes, they had something called, there was a Black Adoption Project. It has started off like trying to get more Black parents to adopt Black children, but unfortunately some Black assimilationists, and if you read, like, and I quote them in a book, if you read their logic, they were self-hating. They said, no, we want to get Black children into white homes because that way they'll be able to be joined into society. So they were the ones pushing it. Now, the result has been a lot of, at that time, they were able to effectively assist white couples in actually adopting Black children. But even this didn't cause the shift in policy of the United States. Again, the United States overwhelmingly did not try to take care of Black children. The shift really came from something called the Fleming Rule. So in 1935, around that time, 1935, there was a conference in Washington. They said that there's a real problem. We have all of these white children are going into foster care, they're going into like different institutions, and we're paying for all this. We want white mothers to be able to take care of their children. So because we want white mothers to be able to take care of their children, we're going to pay them to stay home so that they don't work. That way they can give their children more supervision. This is what today we now say welfare. But originally it was called mother's pension. So you were a mother, you get a pension. And of course, whenever Black mothers wanted to take advantage of these pensions, they were not allowed to. And so the states found different ways to block African women from being able to access this. And one of the ways was something called a suitable homes provision. So suitable homes provision said that we're only going to give the mother's pensions to homes that are suitable. So it can't be a home that's too small, and the children, like they can't be like not enough room for the children, and then you have to be working. And another thing they said, man out of the house rules. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of that, but if you had a man in your house, then you couldn't get a pension. So let's say, you know, you had an uncle that's just staying with you. They would not let that happen. That would be reason for you to actually lose your pension. This was all aimed at African women. At the same time, also, they're doing different things to try to sterilize African women. And they've sterilized hundreds of thousands of African and Native American women in the United States to try to control our population inside of that way. So this changed in 1961. Now, this man is supposedly well-meaning when he did this, but it was a U.S. Secretary of Hugh. His name was Arthur Flemings. He said, okay, you guys are denying all these Black women from receiving a pension. So if that's the case, if their home is so unsuitable, if this home is so bad, then you also need to take those children and put them in foster care. Otherwise, why are you leaving the children with these people who, if their homes are so bad? Well, the result was the states, especially in the South, they said, okay, we'll just put them in foster care. 150,000 African children were taken from their families and placed into foster care immediately. So at this point, it's not a coincidence. Whenever foster care becomes something that's Black, or Black children are being brought into the foster care system, the system becomes one that is criminalized. And this happens all the time. If you look at whenever African families go into a certain place, all of a sudden you'll see criminalized policies coming towards us. So the 1970s really saw the amount of African children in the child welfare system significantly increased. There's a few laws. There was the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act that essentially made child welfare something that was a family surveillance. So you had people doing investigations and they were working with the police and they had to write these reports. So taking something that was charitable and now making it something that's criminalized. Now, Jimmy Carter, he said he was going to try to reverse the drastic increase of children inside of the foster care system. So he said, I'm going to put some policies in place that were going to help support families instead of trying to just take their children. And whenever he adopted this law, Adoption Assistance and Child Welfare Act of 1980, it did have a small effect in the short amount of time that it was actually working. The foster care population shrunk by 50%, but this was before the HIV/AIDS epidemic and the crack epidemic, and we know what happened to African people as a result. This drastically changed the Black community, and right after, like, this law didn't even get a chance to really have a significant impact, Ronald Reagan, very conservative right-wing president, he came in and cut the whole program. And he, at the same time he did this, he was saying a lot of stereotypes of Africans. So he was calling African women welfare queens, men were thugs, the babies were crack babies. And these were very prominent in the media. You would constantly hear conservatives using this rhetoric about African people. I don't know if anyone's ever seen this movie. It's called Losing Isaiah, but this shows you the media that was going on about, you know, how Black women are just crack whores and Black babies are crack babies. They have to be rescued. And this movie was actually, Halle Berry. She was a crack mother who left her child in a dumpster, and a white family came and took the child and took care of him. And whenever she was clean, she wanted to get her child back, but the child really loved the white family. So it was, if you ever seen the movie, you should watch it, just for context. And so in 1986, African children were 15% of the population, but 35% of the foster care population. Now, there were a number of laws that started attacking the Black family because, as we said, the system creates these problems and they tried to address it inside of ways. So one way they tried to address the problem was the 1994 crime bill. I don't want to go too much into that. I'm sure many of you probably have heard of it, but essentially the war on drugs was targeted at African families, and the mass incarceration rate rose drastically. African men left and right were being incarcerated, and they were given really tough penalties, like 3 strikes laws. You could have three like misdemeanor felonies, you know, nothing too crazy, but those 3 felonies, let's say one time you sold crack, the next time you were just found with crack in your hand, the next time, let's say you got in a fight, automatic, life in prison. Crazy. So African families, they were demonized in media, as I said. And this is a quote from Newt Gingrich. He was the Speaker of the House at the time. He actually said this. He said, young unwed mothers should be denied welfare. And if, as a result, they can't provide for their children should be put in foster care, or in orphanage is what it actually says. Okay, so let's talk about what happened in the child welfare scene. There was a number of laws that were enacted as a response to these conditions. One, they had these laws basically that if you had an African child, you had to try to place them with a Black child. This was something that came about from the Black Power movement. Some Black social workers pushed that this be a part of the law. Well, in 1994, they said, no, not at all. From now on, caseworkers can't even consider a child's race. So you have a Black child, you have a white parent or Black parent, you cannot even consider their race whenever you're placing that child. And the really hard-hitting law was the Adoption and Safe Families Act. Now, this is a time where African families were really going through. Like I said, there was the prison industrial complex. There were also cuts to welfare because since welfare was now a Black program, you know, they had to basically get the people to get off welfare and be self-sufficient and all that stuff. So there are all these cuts to welfare. At the same time, where you have fathers in prison, you have mothers who can't even make ends meet because their husbands or partners are in prison. At the same time, you have this law that says that if your child goes into foster care, you have 15 out of 22 months to get your act together, which is about a year. You have 1 year of your child being in foster care to get your act together, or else automatically we're going to terminate parental rights. And what you saw is a vast increase of families where their parental rights were terminated. We have a saying called legal orphans. There's a lot of children that, as a result of this law, they're technically orphans because their legal rights to their parents have been severed. And at the same time, there's not enough people to adopt them. So you have children who they don't have a parent according to the law. And that's been unfortunately disproportionately African children. So any questions before we break this down? Okay, so let's take what we know about the child welfare system and do a systems analysis. I mean, what was the goal of this system whenever it went from no African children really being in the foster care system or the child welfare system to an influx? Anyone want to give some thoughts?
I mean, I want to give room for some other people to comment, but I just feel angry right now. I mean, it's becoming
Me too, man.
yeah. I mean, this is like, you know, this is the social architecture that you don't really see, but actually when you think about it, it's like blatantly in your face now. And yeah, it's such an injustice.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I've done this presentation for white audiences, and a lot of times you hear them like self-analyzing, like, wow, like I realized all this time I've been making decisions about Black children, and it was really like more so because we wanted to control their families. And so it's been interesting, like a lot of child welfare culture, and I'll say this like as someone who practiced in that field, a lot of it is racialized and we don't even know it. Early on, I talk about this in the book, early on, I was doing things that I come back to realize, wow, I really became a part of the system, which is why I'm not a fan when people say, oh, we just need to have more Black people inside of these positions, because again, with systems analysis, the system is not going to have anyone in a position who is going to disrupt that. So if you are one actor, single actor, trying to change an entire system, you will be rewarded by doing what the system wants you to do, and you will be penalized whenever you don't do what the system wants you to do. So I started to feel, I would say, very isolated in my position. The more I started reversing course and actually trying to fight for keeping families together versus the automatic just, oh, save the child, keep them away from the parent.
Yeah, like
Sorry, go ahead, Nigel.
well, my parents are Windrush immigrants, and you can see now very, very clearly that, you know, the whole goal was to subdue them, make sure that they stayed docile, and assimilate them into the culture to make sure that they stayed as industrial subjects. Like, that is completely clear to me now.
Yeah.
We have some comments in the chat as well. Pauline says, it is a tragedy as I work in finance for children's services and it is based on money. And we've got another comment, it was private, saying it has been completely destructive, but hidden in policy. And most people are ignorant of the causes. And I would say that it seems like exactly that, like a deliberate mission to destabilize the African family unit, hidden in policy.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is why my goal is, I really hope, if I can do anything on this, is to help people understand at least the context of, I'll say, at least those laws that I went over that came out in the 90s, because they're just a part of the law. Like, I just know, oh, okay, you only have 1 year, you know, to get your act together. But not even researching the law, I didn't understand what this came out of. And we just accept it, which I think is a bigger critique of law in itself. That we don't necessarily look at the social engineering that's happening behind the scenes. We just accept the law, like, this is it, this is what it is, so we have to adhere to it. And that's been very dangerous for our people, I think.
We have a comment here, or two comments actually. One is from Charlotte saying, the dilemma is the child welfare system also provides the jobs. So there's kind of like a, yes. And then Shara says, kind of ironic that they see the Black parent, Black mothers, to be deemed as unfit to raise their own children, when during slavery, Black mothers were the caregivers to white children. It's a very good point.
Very good point. And that's constant. I always laugh at people when they say Black people are lazy. Like, we're so lazy that y'all needed us to build your whole country. That's so crazy. Or you needed us to work on your plantations. Like, really?
And we have a comment again saying that there is a deliberate post-colonial continuation of racial oppression. It seems to be morphing, but keeping the same intention of damage and removal. So if we apply the systems analysis to I guess, the entire superstructure as it is, it continues on this mission.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And that's why I think it's important for us to challenge the internal colonial structures. You know, some of us are more readily able to challenge colonialism as far as, let's say, if we're looking at countries in Africa or countries in the Caribbean, but we should also understand that this is what we're living. You know, whether US or wherever you are, whenever you're in a white supremacist society, they relegate us to being internal colonies. And, you know, this system, there's so many other systems, you know, this is just one I chose to write about, but you can do the same analysis of the education system or the prison industrial complex. There's so many systems that come together. And I do also want to say, like, it's funny, like, I know one comment was that this is where the jobs are. And that's the truth. Like, these are where the jobs are. Like, if you're African, just as we'll be employed. And because of that, a lot of people try to justify the child welfare system and say, well, racial disproportionality can't be because of racism, because most caseworkers are Black. But as I said, as a Black person working inside of the system, I've been rewarded for taking stances against families that I now realize were in keeping with the white supremacist purpose. So unfortunately, I think generally, like, the system uses us, and I think also lessens our impact. You know, it makes us voiceless whenever we take these positions, and that we're not going to be a challenge to it. Because let's be real, if any of us were a challenge, we would be done away with. I don't know if you ever seen it. I mean, I've talked to Black prosecutors. Whatever they try to, like, do right by the people, that's when you see, oh, well, you know, let's get him out of here. Same thing in police departments. So the system knows how to deal with us. And even whenever we take these jobs, you know, we could have a good heart and want to do the right thing, but they find ways to incapacitate us.
Thank you for that. Now we have a question, and I think they're gonna keep on asking this. So how do we resist the system?
Okay, let's go right here.
Thank you.
Okay, so there's a lot of talk about abolishing the child welfare system in the United States, which doesn't go far enough, but this is how the white people are talking about it. And I would say yes, obviously, because again, the system in itself was created for a particular purpose. We know that there are children who do need protected. We know that there are children who are abused sexually. But I think we have to reconfigure the entire way that we address the problem. Instead of having this system that says, okay, we're going to just step in and remove you, and we're going to automatically throw on these timetables and requirements for the parents, I think there has to be a real mindset that's, holistic. You know, what does the child need? Does the child have a stake in this family? Does this child need to be isolated from this family? Or can we find a way to give this child a living arrangement where they'll still be able to keep connection to their culture? But even that would be a complete reversal of the current way that child welfare operates. Now, the other way is to say, you know, if you're going to do foster care, do it under extreme circumstances. In the beginning of the book, I talk about there's a judge who basically took that stance. She's in New Orleans, Louisiana. She said, I'm not going to put any child into foster care. It's an African woman, of course. I'm not going to put any child into foster care unless it's that bad. And that has had a super effect. It's actually the child welfare population plummeted. People have been criticizing her, like, this is going to be dangerous for the children. But as of now, there have been no, we haven't heard stories. And trust me, the whites are waiting. You know, the white system is waiting for this to go wrong so they can say, aha, like, this doesn't work. But as of now, like, her stance or the way that she analyzes and says, I'm only doing this in the real circumstances. Other than that, we'll give the family services, has had a real positive effect on reversing the child welfare population inside of New Orleans. But ultimately, I think we have to, as a community, we have to organize. We have to come together, and we have to be very clear that white society does not solve our problems. It never has. It never has. I don't care any problem that they've said that they've solved for us. It's always been for their benefit and in a way that is not going to be truly good for the health and the growth of Black power. So if we understand that our oppressor or enemy does not have our best interest in mind, we have to turn to each other. And I think the best way to do that is understand we are really on our own. Like, they might say nice things, but we're on our own the same way that we were whenever we were colonized, enslaved. It's still the same. So I think having that real understanding will allow us to advocate for more community control. So I talk about the end, there's a couple of states, they have been trying to get a similar law as the Native Americans got passed with the Indian Child Welfare Act. They've been trying to get a similar law for African children, giving higher burdens of proof. Whenever you go into court, you have to prove more in order to take an African child. And more services for families. There's a number of things they're trying to do. While obviously not against that, I support it. I don't think it's far-reaching enough. I feel like no white court should have jurisdiction over an African child. That's my true feeling, or an African family. I feel that the way that we should be thinking is internal self-determination. So there's a right to self-determination, of course, with nations. We call that external self-determination, but there has also been recognized in human rights law the right to internal self-determination. The idea is that whenever the state has proven that they will not do right by you, and no matter what, they're not going to treat you as a real person or treat you as a true citizen, you have a right to basically have your own control over your own communities. Now, the closest thing in America we have to this would probably be the Native Americans. So today they have tribal jurisdiction. And I think it's given a lot of benefits. They do have a lot of control over their education systems, but unfortunately, the United States government still kind of pegs it to their own system. So it's not completely independent. But I think having the mindset that we're going to try to legally advocate that jurisdiction of African families should be by African people, that to me is the solution. And one way you can do that, so my hypothesis, this is, just something me brainstorming, how could this work? You can have a child welfare system or a African child welfare system driven by African people who are the best service providers. So mutual aid organizations, the funny thing is that with mutual aid organizations, because the people who are receiving are also the people who are running the operation, it's been very much more responsive to communities. Whereas whenever you have a white institution and they're the one that are giving the services, the result with that has been paternalism, has been colonialism, has been ill treatment. You're poor, so I don't have to give you the same respect that I would give to a white person. So we've seen this inside of white institutions that are controlled by the state. But what we see in the alternative is whenever we have institutions that are controlled by the community, mutual aid institutions where the people who are giving you the services also have a stake in these services, there's very different outcomes. And there are many examples of mutual aid. There's housing mutual aid, mental health, daycare, so many. And we have, like I said, the African culture that we can draw from and coming up with different solutions so that we can build institutions, because that's really the only solution to me is organization. We have to have organizations that are going to combat the organizations that are coming at us and victimizing us. If we can't have an alternative for our own people, then we're just subject to whatever the white supremacist system delves out to us. So that's really the end of my presentation. I don't know if anyone has any more questions.
Thank you very much for that. Right away, we do have a question from Pauline. Is it possible to share practices to reduce fostering of African children in the USA with African social care professionals in the UK?
Yes, so I do talk about it in the book, and let me see if I can find this. Let me stop sharing, if that's okay. If I can find the judge. Okay, Judge Ernestine Gray. I'm gonna put this article in the chat. And that might give some inspiration to anyone. Actually, let me do another article, but this one you have to be a member. So yeah, hopefully this will give some inspiration. I also cite a number of books, a lot of them that talk about healing the African family. So this is something I think that a lot of our people have been doing for a long time and struggling for a long time. So I'm not the person who's done that type of work. I've just done like work as far as research. But there are a lot of books, a lot of them that I cite about how you heal African families apart from the child welfare system. Also, Patricia Hill Collins, I believe that's her name. Sorry. Dorothy Roberts wrote a book on the child welfare system where she breaks down a lot of alternatives as well. And she basically wrote about the child welfare system in the United States. But I do emphasize, we are still overrepresented in the child welfare population. So, you know, we all need to strategize together. We haven't figured this thing out too.
There's a comment from Emeka that says, there would also have to be a military component to protect and defend the institutions that we develop through organization. The closest to this is in America. The closest to this in America was the Black Panther Party and the Black Liberation Army. Listen,
this is the struggle of internal colonialism, is how far are you able to go? Because we've seen what happened with the Black Panther Party. And recently there was a group that came out, the NFA, was it? Not effing around coalition or something like that, NFAC. And the leader, they were out with guns. I don't know if anyone saw this. They were going to the Confederate monuments where people like the Trump people were meeting and everything. And they were just going peacefully with their guns. They were monitoring some of the protests that came out from Black Lives Matter. Randomly, the leader of it, all of a sudden, there's an image of him. He's holding his gun. The FBI said, oh, he was aiming at a FBI agent on the roof. So his man is in jail right now. So we see what they do, you know, whenever we militarize. You know, side note, you know, my personal position is that the ultimate goal for African people, you know, is not within the white supremacist society, but by going and developing our African nation. So whether it's, you know, seeing a free Africa that's going to advocate for us simultaneously, or whether you just repatriate to Africa, like I think that we have to look to Africa as far as where we'll be able to have that type of military strength, because they don't attack people that are Chinese like that here. We saw like that when that one attack happened, all of a sudden all these laws came out. Like, don't let a country that is sovereign and independent and a threat to the United States see their citizens being brutalized. You're gonna see something very different happen.